Hey there! On this channel we talk about how to build confidence, and that already is quite difficult. But it's particularly difficult for people who are switching between and mixing different cultures. That is because confidence is highly context dependent. You know this, you might be extremely confident when it comes to your career, talking to your colleagues or even giving presentations at work. But when you have to go out and meet some strangers in a bar or a club, it might be a complete different picture and you suddenly feel stifled. The same way, you can be extremely confident in one cultural context, let's say in your homeland, but when you move out of that culture and move to a different country, you lose that confidence entirely. And that's a very typical experience for immigrants. And in this video, I will use my personal experience of growing up as a mixed Indian and German man in Germany to illustrate those difficulties and to show you my mental frameworks that I've built in order to resolve those cultural confusions and build the kind of confidence that transcends cultural boundaries. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Achil Rudolf. I am a social confidence coach and I work primarily with men to help them build an amazing social life and find the right partner for a long-term relationship. And for the last few years, I've been focusing primarily on Indian men who live in the West, and there are several reasons for that. One reason is that Indians tend to be good students. They have a certain respect for a teacher and they take work seriously, and they also are often very successful and smart in their career and have already figured out kind of what they want in life, and their goals are also often aligned with the kind of goals that I have in my own life. They're more relationship and long-term family oriented than many other ethnicities, but most importantly, they also share a lot of the same problems that I faced in my own life. Coming from the Indian culture, there are certain mindset barriers to overcome when you want to date in the modern dating market, for lack of a better word. And it's a topic that I had to struggle with a lot, and I found a way to deal with it, but it's still an extremely present conflict in my life, and I'm kind of obsessed with it at this point. And so in this video, I want to tell you a few of those stories in my life that actually led me to take this as my focal point in my career and become a dating coach specialized in cross-cultural social relationships. Since my personal history and many of my clients' histories are shaped by that Indian culture, I will use the Indian and Western culture as the main topic here in this video, but the principles will be transferable to any kind of cultural dichotomy. And in this video, I will be sharing a few of those personal stories that I've never really told before. Some of them are not fully processed, some of them are going to make me emotional, and that's also the reason that I thought I should just record this video in one go. I shouldn't even edit it, it's gonna be a bit messy anyways, so I'll just keep those little speaking mistakes and pauses that are sometimes too long in it to give you that unedited, raw, deep talk feeling. So let's start at the beginning of my life so that you have the context of where I'm coming from. I was born into a mixed family with an Indian mother and a German father, and you might wonder, how did they meet back in the 1980s? Well, believe it or not, they got an arranged marriage. My father was drawn towards Eastern spirituality, and he was also not very happy with the dating landscape in the West at that time. He grew up during the 1960s counter-revolution, counterculture, and so he went to that spiritual ashram in India and learned meditation from a guru, and my mother was also part of that ashram, and the people in that ashram arranged that marriage. And after the wedding, they moved to Germany. And my father realized that while he was still quite enchanted by those spiritual aspects of Indian culture, he was actually not a big fan of many other aspects in the Indian culture. Similarly, my mother was also quite shocked by many of the things that she then started being exposed to in Germany. And so from an early age, from day one really, there was this conflict in my household between my father's more Western and my mother's more Indian values, and that became the defining conflict of my youth. In fact, there were also a lot of fights between my parents that were traced back to that cultural incompatibility. And I remember I was even a bit scared at that point as a young child of them actually getting a divorce because of this incompatibility. And I think that is actually also one of the reasons that I ended up becoming a coach for relationships, because I wanted to make sure that I get this right. I saw my parents bickering, and I knew at that point already that I wouldn't have a lot of difficulties making okay money and getting a good job. But what seemed very scary and difficult to me was making a marriage and a family work and having a relationship that didn't end up in fights or even divorce, like in many of my friends' parents' cases. So in this time already, my mother would always bring me back to India, and we would visit the Indian side of the family there quite a lot. And it was always fun, it was an adventure. But at the same time, I also started seeing many of those flaws in the Indian culture. And I was already influenced and already shaped by the Western education at this point. So a lot of the things that I was seeing in my Indian family just seemed weird to me. For example, I was seeing that conformism and that focus of Indian culture on being always polite, being always respectful, always following the rules. And sometimes it was at the expense of the more direct honesty that I was used to from Germany. And oftentimes it really went too far. Like, I saw a lot of people, and I saw it in myself as well, that I was very scared of my parents' judgment. Actually, I still feel that inside of me now, that fear of saying something wrong and upsetting someone, oftentimes excessively caring about what other people think rather than caring more about what you think yourself and expressing that. So it becomes toxic. It becomes this kind of fake diplomacy, and those things just started to annoy me a little bit, and I saw more of those things, but I couldn't really express my concerns about these things. I couldn't really talk about it, and the reason was that my mother was very keen on imbibing Indian values in me. She was the ultimate, the singular authority in my life on Indian culture, because we were living in Germany and she was the Indian influence in my life. So I think she took it on her to channelize the best of Indian culture into me, but that often led to her idealizing the Indian culture. And when I saw a difficulty and saw a problem I had and a critique with Indian culture, I think one of her responses was that she felt, oh, he's questioning Indian culture, that's a problem. And instead of debating it out with me and finding a way for me to understand what Indian culture really was and meant, oftentimes the response that I would get was, you don't understand Indian culture. And in a way that's valid, because I was socialized in Germany, so I didn't understand a lot of the things. But that statement, you don't understand, you're too German, it came with a lot of pain, it came with a bit of disappointment, it caused certain emotions in her and in me. And so it usually just ended the discussion. There was nothing that I could say, and there's nothing that you can logically say when someone says, you don't understand this, because you're just not Indian, right? So that's what it made me feel like. I felt like, oh, so I'm kind of supposed to be Indian, but when I have a problem with the Indian culture and I disagree with something, then I'm told that I'm not actually Indian. And that put me into a really peculiar spot, because I felt I was expected to play by the rules, participate as an Indian in Indian culture, but I was not really allowed to question those rules and also to shape those rules. So the way I'd like to actually visualize this here, I brought a little board. is there's these two big circles. Let's say Indian culture and there's German culture. And in my youth, in this time, I wasn't quite sure where I was standing. I mean, I grew up in this bubble, but there was a very strong influence from this side, kind of pulling me over here. Hey, you're actually Indian, and you should behave like this and that. But then when I came here and I stepped into the Indian culture, I was often kind of pushed out again by this sentiment: you don't really understand, you're not Indian enough. And you're not allowed to question and criticize this big bubble here. So that left me quite confused, and I guess in the end it often led me to this position here in the middle, in no man's land. And that felt lonely. In this time I started keeping my thoughts to myself, and I felt like, okay, if I'm not really Indian, not really German, I'm not sure who I should even talk about with these very difficult questions. So I became a bit of a more silent guy, someone who just thought a lot but didn't really express, and this tendency actually continued way into my later adolescence and even work life. And this time I didn't feel like I was really growing and evolving much in my thoughts, because they were just kind of stuck. And I felt like I can't really talk about those things with anyone. So I didn't talk with anyone. And then when you don't talk with anyone about this kind of stuff, it also doesn't really change. It kind of rots, and my thoughts just didn't improve. And in many ways my life didn't really improve, because I was just stuck in the same mental paradigm. And then that led to me actually having even less confidence in sharing what I was thinking. So it led me into this downward spiral where I was becoming more and more silent. And I ended up becoming a more shy and insecure teenager, and I actually believed at the time that it was mainly because of my skin. I had a bad acne in that time, and that was a very obvious reason for me to believe that I'm shy and I shouldn't really go out there and interact much. But now looking back, I understand that it was almost, or probably equally important, that I had this cultural confusion, and I felt like I was between those two groups, not really part of either group. And that felt isolated. And part of the reason I'm working now to resolve these kinds of issues and helping others and actually thinking about it to the point where I can see this stuff very clearly for myself is that I know that my children will have those same problems if I don't resolve them. It's really not easy when you're between two cultures like that. And this spot here in the middle, it was actually not a big problem for me to be there, because since the Indian influence was still very strong, I was actually mostly expected to perform well and get good at academics, get good at school. And being in the middle there, being in this lonely spot, wasn't a big problem, because it actually helped me focus more on my studies. Being a little bit lonely, being a little bit more shy, helps you, ironically, in being successful at school. And so there was no counterforce in my cultural environment that said, hey, there's a problem here, you should fix this. Rather, it helped me excel and go to the best universities, kind of stay on track, pass exams, and keep studying what the institutions told me to study. But while I didn't really let out my thoughts in this time, I was still observing and having lots of thoughts. And in this time, I studied and learned all the different kinds of trigger points that are existent in this conflict of the two cultures, the Indian versus the German. And I got really aware of those. I had to get really aware of those, because I knew if I touched these subjects, there will be a fight between me and my mother, between me and my father, or between my father and my mother. Even worse. There were certain topics that I knew would lead to those conflicts bubbling up, and of course there was dating, sexuality, party culture, drugs, but there were also lots of more subtle trigger points that I discovered in these years. And just to give you an example, there was a certain inconsistency of many Indians that I met in this time who were actually complaining about Western culture, but at the same time living abroad. And some people in my own family came to the West and started saying that they really didn't like it and that they actually wanted to move back to India. But oftentimes when I observed them for many years, they just ended up staying in the West. And sometimes I would ask, so when are you actually going back? Didn't you say that that's what you want to do? And they would say, yeah, they really want to leave. But then they didn't. And so in those kinds of instances, I realized that there was some tension, and clearly they preferred the West overall. They were just not really able to express that and to admit that to themselves. Because if India and if the East was so much better, then they would have gone. They voted with their feet. And so these kinds of experiences happened a lot, where I started noticing points of conflict, points of tension in the psychology of Indians or mixed Indian Western people living abroad. I had to start at some point emancipating myself, though, from this position of being nowhere and not being part of a group, not being able to really express myself. And before I was able to say, yeah, now I'm going to start expressing, I did something else. I actually just went to India. And after college, I decided to do my first job for 3 years in India. And I lived in the north of India, many different cities, did a work there. And that way I actually got to make my own picture of Indian culture and India. Till then, I had always seen India through the eyes of my mother, who had brought me back and showed her the picture that she wanted me to see, that often idealized picture. But now I could see it through my own eyes and see that there was so much more to Indian culture. And what I had seen was just my family's culture. And that family wasn't even a very typical Indian family. It was also a kind of alternative Indian family. And so that already opened up my eyes to what it means to be Indian and what Indian culture really means. But then there was another key event, really pivotal event in my life, where I realized that Indian culture, that thing that my mother was always referring to, this externally defined static object, doesn't exist at all. There was a family member, and he was a little bit older than me, and he was idealized as the perfect role model for me. He was embodying the Indian values in the perfect way. So he was family oriented, he respected the elders, he was generous, he was spiritual, he was really good looking, and he was successful in his career as well. He was basically the total hero of my youth. And I was supposed to look up to him and emulate him, and I did that for a while, but I also ran into conflicts because of this general observations that I made. I also saw those a lot in him, and I started realizing that we have certain differences, and I kind of swallowed them and I just downplayed them. And the Indian culture requires that you respect and love and be polite to elders, and so I did that. And a few years later he got married, and he also didn't really have a good time dating and finding a partner on his own, so he got an arranged marriage. And I visited that young family at some point in their city because I was going there for a work trip anyways. And one day of my visit, I came back quite late to their place. I think that already irritated them a little bit. And the next morning I got up a little later, and this relative of mine, he was already gone, he had gone to work. So I was alone in the house together with the wife. And I stayed during the day, and in the evening when my relative returned, He took me aside and he said, "Hey, it's actually not so cool that you are staying alone with my wife at home. You should go somewhere else during the day." And I was a bit surprised. I mean, it was not like I was hitting on his wife or anything. And he explained to me, no, this is kind of against the Indian culture. As an unmarried man, you shouldn't be with my married wife at home. I was quite shocked, but I didn't know any better. I was still in this mindset that I don't really know exactly what Indian culture is, but anyways, I guess I have to follow it. And so I left that place and I was a bit shocked. So I called my mother and I told her, "Hey, this is what happened. Did I do anything wrong? Did I actually break any Indian culture rules?" And she said no. She was a bit shocked. And she was like, this is not Indian culture at all. It's Indian culture to be together with the family. And it shouldn't be a problem at all. It caused a bit of outrage and conflict in my family. This story kind of goes on and there are lots of details that are not relevant for the point I'm trying to make here. The point I'm trying to make is that for the first time in my life, I observed two Indians, not just two Indians, but two Indians in my own family, fundamentally disagreeing on what Indian culture actually is and what it prescribes. And that's when it dawned on me. That's when I realized Indian culture, like any culture, is just a made-up construct. It's just what some people think and say. One person says one thing, the other person says another thing. And why shouldn't I start contributing my opinion? I felt like I was here in the middle and I didn't really have the right, but that was my decision. Why didn't I decide to say, yes, I can contribute? And yes, I'm not exactly part of the core of this culture, but I'm at the edge and I still can contribute. Just because I'm a little bit further outside doesn't mean that I cannot contribute to what Indian culture means. So in a similar way, when you move to another country as an immigrant, let's say, and you live there for a while, there's got to be that point at some point where you say, actually, I'm not just a guest anymore. I've been living here for a few years. Maybe you got a permanent residency, maybe you got the citizenship. And at some point it's time to take ownership and say, yes, I'm also part of that culture and I have the right to contribute. And that was a really important step for me because that was the moment where I stopped feeling like a foreigner in both cultures. And that's going to be an important step for every immigrant because otherwise you will always feel like this foreign object. So I started adopting this very different paradigm, which was that, yes, I am Indian and I'm also German at the same time. I'm actually here. And this feels a bit weird because most other people only have one circle and one national identity, and I have to have two. Because the alternative is being here, being outside of both circles, and that's just something I couldn't accept anymore because that meant loneliness. That means not being part of any group. So I had to start saying to myself and believing to myself that I am both. I am Indian and I am German. And that's something I had to claim. I had to actually just assert that. And there would be people, even now, who say, what the hell, you're not Indian. And I have to say, no, you're wrong, I am Indian. You have a problem with that? So that was the time when I started realizing that I have this responsibility and it's a bit of an extra burden to accept two cultural identities. Because if I'm not both, then I'm neither. And of course, I'm not a typical Indian. I'm also not a typical German. I am a German at the edge, and I am Indian at the edge of what it means to be Indian. So I started seeing it like there's these two cores. There's a core of the culture, and there's an edge of the culture, and I'm clearly at the edge. But as someone on the edge, my contributions are not just valid. I'm not just allowed to contribute to both cultures, but also, in fact, my contributions are extremely valuable. Because as someone on the edge, as a mixed person, or for you maybe as an immigrant, you can contribute things that people in the core cannot contribute. They cannot see it, because for them it's like water to fish, you know? They cannot even see culture, because for them it's just what surrounds them all the time. Whereas for you, who's come in touch with other cultures, who's crossed cultural divides, you had to become aware of what it means to be Indian. You had to become aware of all these cultural rules that people in here kind of follow blindly. And so you have a unique opportunity to actually speak up and contribute things to the cultures that other people could never do. And so that's what I started doing. I started speaking up and saying what I actually thought and not holding it back anymore. And that really triggered a lot of changes in my life. I want to visualize this like radio waves. I just started sending out radio waves in different directions. Also towards the German side, but mainly towards the Indian side, because that was where the tension was more present, where it had more suppressed conflict. And when I spoke up like this and I started actually sharing my truth and sharing my observations and sharing my truths, I realized that there were lots of other people out there who actually also had similar ideas and agreed with me. And I connected with them through social media. Because there are lots of people like me who are kind of on the edge of cultures. They're spread out all over the place. But when I started sending out these signals, they actually responded and they tuned in. So I attracted a lot of people who actually said, thanks for saying that. That's something that most other people don't have the courage to say, or don't have the clarity to say, or don't have the experience and the exposure and the information to say. And this is still a minority, right? These people that really agree with me and really resonate with me, but since social media allows you to reach people all over the globe, that can still be, in absolute terms, a huge crowd. And that's kind of what happened. It obviously led to a certain breakthrough in my business, because I was able to just suddenly build an audience online. And it also gave me a certain feeling of connectedness and community. Also, those followers that I gained, most of them were actually Indian. And so now I had something to back up my claim that I'm Indian, because I started speaking about Indian culture and 40,000 Indian people started following me. And that is a good evidence that I am actually Indian myself. And I felt connected with those people. Even though I was still at the edge of this national identity here, I started connecting with people from all over the world, and we had other commonalities. Maybe we're not so similar when it comes to national identity. We're all over the place, but of course there are many more dimensions for commonality. National identities are just one lens to see groups through. There are obviously many other groups that are basically in different dimensions. And so I started seeing all these different circles. Now I'm going to really destroy this painting here. These circles are really in different dimensions, and in those circles I was often right at the center. And I built my own circle with my own following, where I really felt like, oh, now I'm actually part of a big group of people who really like to talk about something, that I like to talk about too. And I often can have better conversations with those people in those communities than I can have with people in real life, even sometimes friends and family, because friends tend to have different problems. My family, I couldn't really talk about this stuff with them because they're kind of too close and too personally involved. But with people online, I can actually find people that have a very similar problem to the problem that I have myself, and who would be interested to hear me like this, ranting for 1 hour about a topic that I'm passionate about. And the best part is that I can actually use all the knowledge and the experiences and the conflicts that I have experienced in my own life to reach those people. Because it turns out that what was suppressed inside of me, the problems that I was facing, are very similar to the problems that lots of other people out there are facing, and what is suppressed in all of those other people as well. And you know, there are different ways to reach those people in the world that are kind of on the edge and have certain tensions with the core of the culture. And one way is to actually talk about the problems that those people face. One way is to kind of trigger them and elicit emotional responses that come because of the problems that they had, that I also had. But another one is actually to trigger the core, to attack the core so that the core gets a little bit upset, and that also attracts the people on the edge. And I can do both because I know what was suppressed inside of me, and I know how to fight through it and how to resolve that. But I also know that there are lots of things that would trigger people like my mother or my Indian family. And I know them very well because I have done that. And I had to be very careful not to do it. But now I can kind of do it online. And what triggered my mother and my Indian family triggers a lot of other Indian mothers and fathers and families. And when I started doing that and started playing around with expressing my real thoughts and not being scared of upsetting some people, I realized that there was actually a huge global tension. And there was not just a tension between the cores and the edges. I'm gonna draw this one more time. There was not just a tension here between people in the core and people in the edge, but there was also a huge, almost like a culture war going on between those different cultures. And there was a lot of hate and a lot of resentment, a lot of stuck up emotion and overproportional responses when I started talking about those conflict points here. And that's something that I wasn't really aware of until I started speaking out about it. Because for me, that war was kind of the norm. It was the standard. It was the water that I was swimming in as a fish. I was born into that culture war. So it didn't really strike me as a war. So that all helped me reach more people, but also get more clarity and more feeling of connectedness. And apart from just reaching those people and helping others, it really helped me personally because I can now let out all these unresolved thoughts and tensions that I was carrying around with me from my youth. And some of them are not yet fully thought through. You should have realized by now that in this video I'm saying some things that I haven't fully found my final verdict on, but it's extremely therapeutic and healing for me to let those things out and to actually express them so that I can debate them with people out there and improve them. And that's one reason that I make videos like this. Like, a video like this will probably not get a lot of views because it goes into that depth. If you're still here, you're a very rare breed. I appreciate that a lot. But I also do these videos for myself, to be able to resolve those tensions. In a way, my whole career path is partly a therapeutic decision. It's almost like a rebellion or a protest against what I was supposed to do and against all those suppressed feelings and thoughts from my youth. If you think about it, there are really only two other things that my parents would want me to do less, right? So probably the thing that would make them the most unhappy was if I became a porn actor. The second most undesirable situation for me to be in life for them would probably be that I'm unemployed. But somewhere on position 3 or 4 or 5, there is being a dating coach, and I'm doing that. Well, I get a lot of energy from doing something against the grain. I actually like being on the edge. This has become part of my identity. And as I said, it's also healing in a way because I feel like I can make sense of my history. I can make sense of my past and my conflicts and actually weave them into a story that becomes valuable for other people, so that me breaking out of these cultural confusions helps other people break out as well. But at the same time, I want to make clear that I still appreciate the cores of the cultures as well. And I'm not just here to incite this huge war between core and edge and between different cultural cores. I think it's important to use the core and to appreciate and to see its value, because what a cultural core really is it's encoded wisdom from millennia of generations who have gone through difficult problems and solved them so that we don't have to solve them from scratch. And I love the Indian cultural core, and I've benefited from it hugely. I'm forever grateful for not being raised like a typical German. I'm also grateful for not being raised like a typical core Indian. That influence from the Indian culture gave me the kind of stability, gave me the spiritual framework and the work ethic as well to be able to do what I'm doing right now. Yes, it was confusing to be in the middle somewhere, but even that was a valuable experience because now I can turn it into gold. There are lots of shadow sides of my story, but there are also lots of light, bright side. And so I feel uniquely gifted with my history because it equips me now to help other people with that cross-cultural background or immigrants who have to bridge cultural divides. And a helpful metaphor that I'd like to use to wrap this whole video up and to put things into perspective is, I see culture like a kind of dependency or like a framework, like a module. This is a metaphor that works mainly for programmers. But in software, you have these software dependencies. Those are pieces of code that are already written. They solve difficult problems and they work. And if you're a software developer, you will use a lot of those because a lot of problems, you don't have the time to write the code yourself. And it's already been done. And in the same way, I feel like culture contains a lot of software that solves problems, that is tested, that is tried and tested for centuries and millennia. And in 95% of the cases, you should accept and use it. For example, the Indian culture has this tendency towards long-term family formation and spiritual progress. And I totally agree with that cultural bias. That's what brings humanity forward, and it's better than the Western tendency of prioritizing short-term pleasure and sexual gratification. It's working all right in the Indian context, and there are lots of systems and libraries and sub-libraries around that cultural tendency that make this work. For example, there is a practice of meditation, which is part of this whole Indian cultural core. And that, again, is a subsystem, a sub-software that has been written and tested for centuries and millennia, and it's probably not a good idea to reinvent meditation and to set up your whole different system of meditation. That's something that a lot of smart people have developed, and you should use it. If you don't want to dedicate your whole life to creating a new meditation, then you should use something that has already been built and maybe update it a tiny bit. But then there are some aspects of cultures, let's say 5%, where this software, where this dependency is actually a bit outdated. And it has vulnerabilities because the environment changed, because some other dependencies got introduced. And in those cases, you need to be quite aware. So there are these areas in a culture, maybe here and there, where there are actually outdated software pieces. And you, as an active participant in a culture, you need to be able to recognize that and consciously choose which ones you actually accept and which ones you reject and say, no, this is too outdated for me. This doesn't work for me anymore. And in some of those cases, maybe in another 1% of those 5% outdated software dependencies, you actually can improve the software. You can actually, because of your unique position, let's say because you're on the edge and you have the influence from another culture that you can use, or because of your specific experience, or just because of your decision to say, I'm going to dedicate my life to improve this part of culture, you actually can write new software and update that dependency. And what I'm saying is that as an active, as a responsible and full member of the society, it's not just a possibility, but even your responsibility to update the cultural code when you can. In a way, culture, these cores, these bubbles, can be seen like an open source software project. And you can improve certain features and dependencies and develop updates, and then you can actually make a pull request and offer them to the main branch and say to the community, here, there's a problem, I actually have a better solution. Oftentimes they might not actually accept your update, and that's fine, because oftentimes what you can do then is to just run the improved software locally in your own household, in your own life. And that's also the best way to convince others then to accept your update, because you can prove to them that it's working for you. In summary, there is a weakness in the Indian culture and in many other Eastern cultural systems as well, that it doesn't really encourage that kind of critical thought of seeing culture as a dynamic, co-created construct that needs to be updated. And because that mentality is often missing in the Indian culture, it doesn't prepare its members super well for the challenges of the world and of life. And in the middle of the culture, in the core, it might be all right. It might be all right here to work with these slightly outdated dependencies because everyone else is using them too. But when you get to the edge and you interact with other cultures, you will get to experience those vulnerabilities. And as a person on that edge, you have a unique opportunity to synthesize different softwares, different cultural codes, and improve the core. Oftentimes that is a real win-win-win. It's a real improvement for everyone. It's an improvement for the people in the culture that you're coming from. It's an improvement for your life because you're getting to run better software. And it's also an improvement for the people in the culture that you are actually entering, because you are going to be more compatible with that culture if you have better code. So oftentimes you really don't need to sacrifice anything. It's often portrayed like a zero-sum game where if you get more Western values of being more free, being more critical, being more honest, you have to give up the respect and the connection and the family ties of Indian culture. But that's not the case. You can actually find solutions that maintain respect and family ties while making you a more honest and direct person, for example. And I believe that is what it means to be a confident, cross-cultural, culture-transcending human being. It's not to deny your cultural origins and say, I'm something else now, I'm not part of any culture. It's to embrace one's particular mix, to proudly own and honor the amazing heritage of all the cultures that you are a part of, but also to notice and to admit faults and vulnerabilities, and to do the kind of careful thinking and experimentation that is necessary to create a new solution in those few cases where you actually can. There are many different reasons why people become anxious and insecure. For me, that was a central reason, that cultural confusion, combined with the other reasons like certain other features of Indian culture specifically, and also the problems that I had because of my acne. There was a mix of problems there that led me to become shy and not so good at expressing myself. For you, it might be a whole different combination of factors. Whatever the reason is that you are struggling with expressing yourself, building community, and finding the right companions for life, the way out is similar. It's understanding the reasons, understanding those patterns, and then taking action to break those patterns. And usually that involves expressing oneself, communicating better. For me, that is making videos like this where I talk about these things that I usually would never really express, even though it is scary, even though it is difficult for me. You can do this too. You can find your patterns and start counteracting them because you have a billion-dollar super weapon planted on your head, ready to fire. You just have to learn how to use it, how to think well, how to speak well. And once you do that, you will transform. You can change every aspect of your life and send out those radio waves to the world and connect and attract those right people who are actually compatible with you. I do have an intensive training program that guides people on this path. I'd be happy to tell you more about it. If you're interested, you can check out a link in the description where you can learn more. For now, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, maybe even a comment, and subscribe to this channel. Samgat Chadvam, Namaskar.